Looks good.
All
And
right.
what we'll do is if for anybody who has questions, we'll take the questions at the end if time allows. Okay, so think of your questions as she's going along and feel free to drop those in the chat.
All right. And I will turn admitting people from the waiting room to you, Maggie.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right, so let's get going. I want to thank you all again for attending our School and Community Garden Collaborative Workshop. We hold these quarterly. As Maggie mentioned, I'm a UCCE San Bernardino Master Gardener and also the Environmental Education Coordinator. And believe it or not, fall starts next week and it's time to prepare your soil for fall and winter planting. And I want to thank and acknowledge Maggie for putting the information for this presentation together. All right, so first let's talk about what your plants need from the soil. Three main things: water, air, and nutrients. And soil contains a wide variety of microorganisms such as bacteria and fungi. And these microorganisms or microbes help promote plant growth and also prevent disease by their activities in the soil. So soil type, or what we call texture, also plays a role. Soil consists of sand, silt, and clay particles, and the texture is the relative proportions of each. So sandy loam is one of the best types of soil for most plants, and you can do a jar test at home to determine what type of soil you have. So just Google soil jar test and you'll find all kinds of details and instructions. So one thing to note is some plants actually do well in poor soils, particularly natives. So it's important to choose the right plant for your conditions or make the conditions right for you, what you intend to plant. So what do we mean by soil building? Well, it's a series of steps to make your soil ready for planting. So the first step is to add organic matter, such as compost, to make sure there's biodiversity in the soil. And those are all those microorganisms I just talked about. Then we want to make sure that the soil has the right texture and also the right water holding capacity for the plants that we want to grow. So for instance, sandy soil drains water much faster than clay soil. So you want a combination of those different types of materials, sand, silt, and clay, to get the right water holding capacity. And finally, we want to make sure that the beds are properly filled because we want to maximize the amount of soil in the bed or container so that we have room for the roots to grow. But we don't want our bed or container to overflow when the plants are watered or it rains. And one thing to consider is that soil tends to compact over time, so you will need to most likely add each season. So soil building depends on the situation. So one scenario is new plantings, where you're starting from scratch to create the best soil for what you're planting. An example is starting a new bed or container. Another scenario is refreshing your bed, your in-ground plot, your container that's already been planted. And examples include planting for fall after the summer crop's been harvested, or a bed or container that's been unused for a while. It's been dormant and you want to bring it back. And then the third case is refreshing soil for perennial plants that have been in the ground for multiple years or seasons. And those would include things like perennial herbs such as sage and rosemary, fruit trees, any kind of tree, shrubs. So just a reminder of what soil needs refreshing for fall. To summarize, beds or containers that have had a fruit or vegetable crop this summer. Beds or containers that have sat empty for one or more seasons. Soil where perennials were growing for many seasons. And also soil that has not been producing well. So it may lack the texture or the nutrients that the plants need to grow. So let's start with soil building for new plants. And this is really important for growing and maintaining healthy plants, and it shouldn't be overlooked. We all want to get those fall plants in the ground as soon as possible, but it's worth spending some time and money to make sure that the soil is going to nourish those plants. You don't want to spend money on seeds or plants and then not have them thrive. So if you're planting in the ground or a raised bed, you may start with some native soil. In a raised bed in particular, the top 6 to 12 inches is the most important, so you can put the good stuff on the top. Then you would add either potting mix. You can add potting mix, you can add potting soil, or sometimes it's called raised bed soil, topsoil, for texture and structure. And then you add compost to get those organic materials into your soil for your microorganisms. And you can also include some amendments like peat moss, vermiculite, perlite to loosen the soil. Just make sure that you mix those components well before you plant. Next, I want to talk about building soil in existing beds or containers, either unused or used during the previous season. So settling and decomposition occurs over time, so it's usually necessary to top off your bed or container. If there's a lot of organic matter in the bed or container, such as old plants and leaves, you're going to need to add some soil in there to improve the structure and to reduce settling. After adding the soil, add about 2 inches of compost to the surface and then mix it in with the top 4 to 6 inches of soil. There's many different composts available. Some examples are cow and chicken manure, mushroom compost, worm castings. You can find all of these at your local big box store or nursery. And a combination of these different types of compost is best. And then to maintain moisture and discourage weeds, add a few inches of mulch on the top. And the photo on this slide shows just how much soil can settle over time. This is the same picture that was shown a few slides ago. So, you know, especially in a container, you can see that soil level go down maybe even 50% in a season or two. So if there's perennial plants that are going to stay in the bed, you want to avoid disturbing the roots when you're amending the soil. So as before, you're going to spread mulch over the surface. Mulch you don't want to mix in with the soil because it's going to bind with the nitrogen and keep it from the roots of the plants. You could also use compost as a mulch or in addition to mulch. And when you spread mulch, you want to avoid burying the stem of the plant and keep it away from tree trunks so that you don't get decay and disease in your plants. So this photo shows a bed with several kinds of perennials in it, and you just want to add a little bit of compost and or mulch to the surface, and that's all you really need to do so you don't disturb the roots. So what if your bed is going to sit empty in the fall? Consider, rather than just leaving it on its own, consider cover cropping it to add nutrients and prevent erosion. Some examples of cover crops are clover and fava beans, and these can add nitrogen to the soil. Just make sure that you're using a non-invasive plant as a cover crop, or else you're gonna spend a lot of time getting that out of the ground when you decide to plant something else. And cover crops are great because they attract beneficial predators and pollinators. So if you want to learn more about cover crops in your area, we have a couple of links here. One good resource is the CalFlora website. It's also called the NRCS California eVeg Guide, and NRCS stands for Natural Resources Conservation Service. And one thing to remember is that most native plants, once established, do not need mulch or fertilizer. And that is the beauty of native plants. You can leave them alone and they're just going to do fine. So really, you don't need to do much, if anything, for soil building for natives. So here are some general tips on keeping your soil healthy. Proper watering is really key. So if you overwater, you're going to reduce the amount of oxygen that gets to the plant roots, and also those beneficial microorganisms. And it makes plants more susceptible to pathogens because they can start decaying. Underwatering is also a problem because it causes roots and microorganisms to die. It can make the soil hydrophobic, and that's a condition where it's going to repel water rather than absorb water. And as I mentioned previously, mulch keeps the moisture in, it keeps the weeds out. It also keeps the soil temperature more consistent, both when it's hot and cold. And then you want to avoid over fertilizing because that'll put salts and chemicals into the soil, and those can run off into water sources. And to reduce pests, you really want to limit the use of pesticides and use integrated pest management practices, IPM. And IPM focuses on the long-term prevention of pests and the damage that they cause by managing the whole ecosystem. So if you're interested in learning more, you can go to the UC IPM website. And then use compost to improve all types of soils. It's really the miracle ingredient that improves water retention in sandy soil, water drainage, clay soil, and is going to add that great organic matter to your soil. And then adding water and organic matter like compost keeps your soil active and alive. You know, it's really a living system. If you don't build your soil on a regular basis, the microorganisms will die and you don't really have like a healthy soil. You just have plain dirt that is not going to nourish the plants. So I want to end this presentation with some tips to improve poor soil. So again, compost is the miracle ingredient. If you have heavy soil, sandy soil, hydrophobic soil, just add compost. And the same with compacted soil. You just need to break it up as little as possible, just enough to be able to add that compost. If your soil is lacking in nutrients, it will need some compost and maybe some fertilizer as well. And you may need to add some amendments to adjust the pH. There are home tests and pH meters you can buy to check the pH. In most cases, the pH needs to be really far off before it becomes a problem. And then if your soil is waterlogged, you want to let it dry, then loosen it as you would for compacted soil, add your compost and amendments. The important thing probably for all of these issues is to really get to the bottom of it to find out, you know, why is this happening? For instance, if you have soggy soil, why is it wet? Has it been overwatered? Is it the composition of your soil? Do you have too much clay? So things like that. And then if you want to learn more about soil, we have videos on many different topics, including mulching and composting. So you can check out our UCCE San Bernardino YouTube channel for videos on soil building and many more topics. We're adding new material all the time, including the recording of this workshop and other presentations. So if you have questions about your soil or any other gardening topic, feel free to call our Master Gardener helpline, or you can also send them an email. And if you send them an email, you can send photos that show what your issue is. We have a few minutes left. If anyone has any questions you'd like to ask now, please put them in the chat and Maggie will read them off to me. So I'd like to thank you for attending our workshop.
Also, let's give, if anybody has anything they want to drop in the chat, feel free to, or if you'd like to unmute yourself. We have a good sized group, but I think we still can, if you guys would like to unmute and ask a question, you're welcome to do that. And otherwise, I think we'll give people just a minute if they're typing or waiting for me to stop talking so they can drop a question or unmute. Then we'll do that. And Debbie, okay, so there's a question in the chat. Is there a resource for quality compost in the Inland Empire? Great question.
Let's see. I know that I have seen lists. The Chino Basin Water Conservation District had a class on irrigation, and they actually had a really nice list of places to get soil and compost. So I think I can, I'll talk to Maggie about that. We can probably share that out.
That sounds great. Yeah, they have the first and third Saturday of every month. They have, if you're in the Montclair area at all, the first and third Saturday of every month from 7 to 10 or 7 to 9, you can come and get compost. It's really good quality compost. They also have mulch. I know that Highland was giving away compost. I'm not sure the quality. I haven't seen it. And there's definitely, as the SB 1383 legislation is asking cities to reduce waste. Debbie, maybe you can expand. I don't know if the cities are required to leave part of it in their city, or can you expand a little bit on that?
all the organic waste that is coming from cities, the legislation does require the city to use it locally. So usually they partner with their waste haulers to provide mulch for the city. So I know that most cities are working on that now. If you have a community or school garden, you may be able to go to your local waste hauler and ask them if they would be willing to contribute some mulch and mulch and compost. And those things you can get at your big box stores. You can get pretty high quality, but it's going to cost you more in some cases if you just get it by the bag. And also they are kind of limited in the numbers of the types of compost that they have. So.
Great. And if you follow us, not trying to plug our social media, I mean, I am trying to plug our social media, but I do try to pretty actively stay on top of partners within the county when they're sharing compost days. So if you do follow us on Facebook, then I try to post when those are coming up and I see those. And then there was another question. Somebody asked about the name of the legislation, and our partners typed that in. So thank you. And then there was another question. And we have a presentation on our YouTube channel that goes more into that in depth. And then we're also doing upcoming workshops about that. So if you're curious about more of that, and Debbie's going to start a really cool program where she is working with communities to sort of help them find out what resources as far as composting, how those cities are collecting compost, where community gardens might be that might be willing to take your compost, like Route 66, for example. So she's going to work on connecting you guys with those resources. Okay, it's 9:30, but one more question. Can I start planting for fall right after building the soil, or should I wait a few days?
I think as long as your compost has been aged, and most of the ones that you can buy commercially have been aged, usually about a year or at least a few months, yes, you can. And I also want to emphasize that you can make your own compost. It really is not, we have some composting workshops. We have many videos on our YouTube channel. You can take the kitchen scraps and garden trimmings that you have in your own yard and start your own compost pile. And as long as you let it age for a bit, a couple of months, you can use it in your garden.
Great. Well, I don't see any other questions, but composting and soil building and composting, right? That's a hot topic, pun intended, right? Stephen, if you do, by the time Debbie introduces you, if you need a few more minutes after your 10:30 slot, we've